CECOT, inside the world's most dangerous prison. The bus didn't have windows. That was the first thing Miguel Santos noticed when they loaded him in. 43 men, zip-tied at the wrists, sitting in total darkness as the vehicle moved for what felt like hours into the Salvadoran countryside. Nobody spoke. Not because they were told not to, because every man on that bus understood, in some primal, wordless way, that wherever they were going, there was no version of this story that ended well. When the doors finally opened, the floodlights hit Miguel's face like a physical force. He squinted, blinked, and through the blur of white light and disorientation, he saw it for the first time. 4-foot walls, guard towers every 80 feet, razor wire coiled so thick it looked like it was growing out of the concrete. A soldier in tactical gear grabbed him by the arm and pulled him forward. Miguel stumbled. The soldier didn't wait. Somewhere behind him, one of the men on the bus began to pray out loud in Spanish. Nobody told him to stop. They just kept walking. CECOT, the Centro de Confinamiento del Terrorismo. Built in just 11 months under El Salvador's president Nayib Bukele, this facility was not designed for rehabilitation. It was not designed for reform. It was designed for one singular, unambiguous purpose: to take the most dangerous men in one of the world's most violent countries and remove them from society permanently. 40,000 prisoners. 40,000. The prison spans more than 166 acres. It holds more inmates than any single facility on the planet Earth. There are no conjugal visits, no phone calls, no sunlight unless the guards decide otherwise. And the guards almost never decide otherwise. Miguel Santos was prisoner number 4,891 to pass through those gates since the facility opened. He didn't know that number. He wouldn't have cared, because standing in that processing corridor at 3:52 in the morning, surrounded by armed soldiers and attack dogs and a silence so thick it felt pressurized, Miguel Santos, a man who had ordered violence, who had inspired fear across 3 municipalities, felt something he had not felt since he was a child. He felt small. Here is what the Salvadoran government wants the world to see when they look at CECOT: rows of obedient, shaved-head prisoners in white uniforms, sitting in silence, stripped of their tattoos, their identities, their power. A symbol, a message sent to every gang member still on the streets of San Salvador. This is what happens to you. But here is the question that nobody in those press conferences ever answers. What actually happens inside? Not in the promotional videos. Not in the presidential tweets. What happens at 4 in the morning when the cameras are gone and 40,000 men are locked inside concrete cells with nothing but their thoughts and each other? What does a place like CECOT do to a human being? Miguel had heard the stories on the outside. Everybody had. Men going in and never being heard from again. No letters. No legal visits in the early months. Families standing outside the gates with photographs, not even knowing if their sons were still alive. He had told himself he wasn't afraid. Standing in that corridor, his boots being taken from his feet, he was no longer sure that was true. In March of 2022, El Salvador declared a state of exception. Within weeks, over 70,000 people had been arrested. Human rights organizations raised immediate alarms. Many of those swept up had no gang affiliation at all. Wrong neighborhood, wrong tattoo, wrong last name. Miguel Santos was not one of those men. Miguel had run collections for MS-13 across the Soyapango district for 6 years. He had been arrested twice before and released both times due to witness intimidation. The Salvadoran justice system had tried to hold him. The streets had always taken him back. Not this time. This time, the soldiers came to his mother's house at 2 in the morning, pulled him out of bed in front of his younger sister, and put him in a vehicle before he could say a single word. No warrant shown. No charges explained. Just hands on his arms and the sound of his sister screaming behind him as the door closed. He had been in transit for 36 hours before the bus with no windows arrived at CECOT. Now he was here. Now the processing officer was handing him a white uniform, 2 sizes too large, and telling him, in a voice completely devoid of emotion, to put it on. Miguel pulled the white uniform over his head and sat down on the concrete bench beside 30 other men who all looked exactly like him now. Same clothes, same shaved head, same expression, somewhere between shock and a forced, dangerous calm. Every marking that had defined him on the outside was gone. The tattoos weren't removed yet. That would come later, but covered, hidden under white cotton. And in that holding area, with its buzzing fluorescent lights and its smell of industrial bleach, something became very clear to Miguel Santos. Everything he had built his identity on for the last decade, his rank, his reputation, the fear he generated when he walked into a room, none of it existed in here. He was nobody. He was prisoner 4891. And the worst part, he could already tell that some of the men sitting beside him had been nobody for a very long time. This was not their first experience being erased. They wore it more comfortably than he did. That terrified him more than the walls. Before we go any further inside these walls, if stories like this are what you're here for, hit that subscribe button right now. Because what Miguel is about to experience goes deeper than any prison documentary you've ever seen. Stay with me. Sitting in that holding cell, Miguel Santos did something he hadn't done in years. He thought about his mother's kitchen. He was born in Sayapango in 1994, the most densely populated municipality in all of El Salvador, a place where the streets were narrow and the nights were loud and everyone knew which corners belonged to which men. His mother worked double shifts cleaning office buildings in San Salvador. His father had left before Miguel started school. There were 4 children. Miguel was the oldest. He had been smart in school. His third-grade teacher, a woman named Senora Reyes, had told his mother that Miguel had a gift for numbers, that he could be an engineer someday. His mother had held on to those words for years. She repeated them like a prayer. But engineers didn't come from Soyapango easily. And by the time Miguel was 13, the MS-13 members on his block weren't asking anymore. They were telling. And the thing about being told by men who have already decided the answer, you learn very quickly that the only real choice is how much pain accompanies your compliance. He chose compliance. He chose survival. And somewhere between 13 and 20, survival started to look a lot like belonging. Soyapango is the kind of place that outsiders drive through with their windows up. It is not a slum in the Hollywood sense. There are markets, schools, churches, families who do everything right and still find themselves caught between forces they didn't create and cannot escape. But it is also a place where territorial violence is not an occasional tragedy. It is a structural condition, a daily negotiation with danger that everyone, from the grandmother selling pupuses on the corner to the 12-year-old walking to school, must perform. Miguel grew up watching men with authority command respect that the government never offered his neighborhood. Police came to Soyapango to collect bodies, not to prevent them. Politicians came during elections, made promises in front of murals, and disappeared. The church offered comfort. The gang offered power. He understood, even as a teenager, that this was a corrupt bargain. He wasn't naive. He had seen what happened to men who climbed the ranks. Most of them were dead or in prison by 30. He had done the math young. But he had also watched his mother come home at midnight with swollen feet and still not have enough to cover rent. And somewhere in the gap between what the world promised and what it delivered, Miguel Santos made his peace with the bargain. Lying on the concrete floor of CECOT's holding cell, he wondered if his mother still thought about what Senora Reyes had said. The first morning arrived not with sunlight but with a siren. A single, flat tone that lasted 3 seconds, and immediately, every man in the holding area was on his feet. Miguel didn't know how they knew. He scrambled upright a half-second behind everyone else and understood instinctively that being the last to move was not an option here. Guards came in formation, 8 of them, tactical vests, rifles at the diagonal. No words, just hand signals. The prisoners moved in a single file line, barefoot on cold concrete, through a corridor that seemed to have no end. Miguel tried to count the doors they passed. He stopped at 20. They were assigned to their cells in groups of 8. Each cell was designed to hold 8 men. The rooms were approximately 12 feet by 12 feet. There was a toilet in the corner with no partition. There were metal frame bunks along the walls. There was a single light embedded in the ceiling behind a steel cage, and it never turned off. Not at night. Not ever. Miguel climbed to an upper bunk, unchallenged, which told him these men were still establishing order, and lay down with his arm over his eyes to block the light. He had been awake for 42 hours. Sleep came anyway. It wasn't restful. By mid-morning of his first day, Miguel had learned the rules of CECOT through observation, because nobody explained them. You learn by watching what happened to men who did the wrong thing. There was no talking during movement. A man 2 rows ahead of Miguel in the corridor spoke to the man beside him. Something quiet, barely audible. A guard was beside him in 2 seconds. The man was removed from the line. Where he went, nobody said. He wasn't in the cell block that night. There were no personal items, no photographs, no books initially, no rosaries, which Miguel saw break several men on his first day. Older prisoners, men who had clearly carried their faith through previous incarcerations, now standing in a cell with nothing in their hands and nowhere to put the grief. Meals happened twice a day. They were nutritionally adequate by institutional standards. Rice, beans, sometimes a small portion of protein. You ate in the cell. You ate what was given. There was no commissary. There was no choice. And perhaps strangest of all, there was almost no sound. CECOT was not loud. It was not the chaotic, shouting, banging on bars prison of television. It was quiet in a way that was more disturbing than noise. The silence of 40,000 men collectively understanding that outburst led to consequences. Miguel ate his rice in silence and began to understand the shape of the place. There were 8 men in cell 14 of Block C. Miguel studied them the way he had always studied rooms, quickly, from the corners of his eyes, cataloging threat levels and alliances before anyone noticed he was doing it. Old habit, the kind that kept you alive on the outside and, he suspected, would do the same in here. The oldest man in the cell was somewhere around 55. He had the kind of stillness that comes not from peace but from having survived so many dangerous situations that the body simply stopped registering alarm. Miguel noted him first. Men who had stopped flinching were always the most dangerous. There was a young man, couldn't have been more than 20, sitting on the lower bunk nearest the door with his knees pulled to his chest, staring at nothing. He had been crying recently. His eyes were dry now, but the path of it was still on his face. 2 men in the far corner communicated through eye contact and micro-expression in a way that told Miguel they had been together before CECOT. Old alliance. He would need to understand the nature of it. The remaining 4 were what you always found in a room like this. Men in the middle. Not leaders. Not broken. Waiting to see how things settled before they decided who to align with. Miguel said nothing. He lay on his bunk and stared at the ceiling and waited. The old man spoke to Miguel first. His name was Elias Moreno. 61 years old, though he looked older. He had been at CECOT since the facility opened, one of the first transfers, part of the original wave of mass arrests. He had been MS-13 once, years ago, before the world turned over several times. Now he was just a man who had been in prisons longer than Miguel had been alive. He didn't ask Miguel about his case. He didn't ask what he'd done or what his rank had been or what neighborhood he'd run. None of that, he said quietly, without looking at him, mattered inside these walls. What mattered, Elias said, was simpler than Miguel would expect. Control your face. Control your reactions. Don't volunteer anything. Don't ask for anything. And never, under any circumstances, let them see you deteriorating. Miguel asked who them was. The guards or the other prisoners. Elias smiled for the first time. It was not a warm smile. Both, he said. Always both. Then he lay back on his bunk, folded his hands on his chest, and closed his eyes. The conversation was over. Miguel understood that he had just received something valuable, orientation from the only man in this cell who actually knew how to survive this place. He filed every word away carefully. At noon exactly, the slot at the bottom of the cell door opened and 8 trays were slid through. Rice, black beans, a small portion of chicken that had been cooked until it had lost any quality that might have once made it identifiable. A cup of water. That was it. That would be one of the 2 meals that defined Miguel's day for however long he was inside these walls. He ate slowly, not because he wasn't hungry. He hadn't eaten in over 18 hours. He ate slowly because eating slowly was the only way to make it last. And because in a place where literally nothing happened, a meal was an event. The young man with the red eyes didn't touch his tray. After 20 minutes, when it became clear he still wasn't going to eat, Elias reached over without a word and moved the untouched tray within reach of the two men in the corner, who split it without acknowledgement. Miguel watched this small transaction and understood it immediately. In here, resources were not wasted. Not even small ones. Not even a half portion of institutional chicken. The economics of deprivation were already operating at full efficiency in cell 14, and Miguel had been inside for less than 12 hours. He finished his rice, drank his water, set the tray by the door. Outside the slot, the corridor was absolutely silent. His name was Carlos Vega, 19 years old. Miguel learned this not through conversation but through the prayer Carlos finally began whispering around 2 in the afternoon, a prayer that included his own name, his mother's name, and the name of a girl in San Miguel that Miguel guessed was either a girlfriend or sister. He climbed down from his bunk and sat beside Carlos. Not close, not intrusively, just near enough to signal that he wasn't alone. Carlos looked at him with red eyes and said nothing. Miguel said, quietly, "First week is the worst. That's what I'm told." Carlos said, "I didn't do it." Miguel looked at him for a long moment. He had heard those words 1,000 times on the outside, in police stations, in courts, through bars. He had learned to assign them a weight of roughly 0. But looking at Carlos Vega, 19 years old, soft-faced, hands without a single identifying mark, he found the words landing differently. He didn't know if they were true. He didn't know if it mattered inside CECOT whether they were true. What he said was, "Doesn't change where we are." Carlos nodded slowly. Then he picked up his water cup, drank, set it down. Small survival, moment by moment. Miguel understood that. By the second night, Miguel understood what sleep deprivation as policy looked like. The lights never went off. Not at 10, not at midnight, not at 3 in the morning. The fluorescent panel in the ceiling cage burned at the same relentless intensity 24 hours a day. It wasn't loud. It didn't make noise. It just sat there above them, indifferent and constant, turning every attempt at rest into a negotiation. Some men pulled white uniform fabric over their faces. Some turned toward the wall. Elias, Miguel observed, simply lay flat on his back with his eyes closed and apparently slept through sheer force of practiced will, the way a soldier learns to sleep in a moving vehicle. Because rest is survival and the body adapts or it breaks. Miguel lay on his side and thought about darkness. He thought about the darkness of the bus with no windows. How terrifying that had been. How, at the time, he would have given anything to be able to see something. Now he would give something considerable to experience 1 hour of actual dark. The young man, Carlos, was awake on the bunk below him. Miguel could tell by the breathing, by the quiet, barely there sound of a man staring at a lit ceiling and calculating how many more nights of this his mind could endure. Miguel closed his eyes again, counted his breaths, tried to disappear into sleep. On the third day, they were taken in groups of 15 to a room that smelled like antiseptic and rubber gloves. Tattoo removal. The Salvadoran government had made it policy. Gang tattoos were to be removed from all CECOT prisoners. It was part of the visual erasure, the stripping of identity that the facility was deliberately architected around. Every symbol that connected a man to who he had been on the outside was to be eliminated. Methodically, permanently. It was not done painlessly. Miguel sat in the chair when his turn came and looked at the ceiling while the laser did its work on his forearms, his neck, the faded markings across his collarbone. He made no sound. This was important to him. He had decided before he sat down that he would not make any sound, and he kept that commitment through 37 minutes of a process that, by any clinical description, constituted significant controlled pain. Elias had told him, on the second night, barely above a whisper, the first thing they take is your appearance. The second thing they try to take is your dignity. You control the second one. Miguel controlled the second one. When it was done, he stood up from the chair, nodded once at the medical attendant, who did not nod back, and walked back to his position in line. He did not look at his arms. On the 5th day, they were given 1 hour outside. The exercise yard at CECOT was not what the word yard typically conjures. It was a concrete enclosure approximately 60 feet by 60 feet, completely enclosed by walls that rose high enough to reduce the visible sky to a narrow rectangle of blue directly overhead. There was no equipment, no shade, just concrete and open air and the knowledge that above the walls, guard towers were occupied and armed. For Miguel Santos, who had spent 5 days under artificial light in a 12 by 12 room with 7 other men, stepping into that enclosure and feeling real sunlight on his face was an experience he was not prepared for emotionally. He stopped walking for a moment. A guard said something sharp. He kept moving. But in that moment, 2, maybe 3 seconds, he had felt something that he could not name precisely. Not hope. Something smaller than hope, but in the same family. Something that reminded him that the world outside those walls still existed. That the sun still ran its route across the sky without requiring permission from the Salvadoran government. Around him, other men did the same thing. Tilted their faces up briefly. Closed their eyes. Some moving their lips in prayer or words too quiet to hear. Carlos walked next to Miguel. He hadn't spoken much in 5 days. He looked up at the thin strip of sky and said, quietly, "I used to take that for granted." Miguel didn't answer. There wasn't anything useful to say. On day 7, something happened in Block C. Miguel never learned exactly what. What he knew was the sequence. A sound from somewhere down the corridor, a sharp, short sound, followed immediately by the alarm tone that was different from the morning tone. Higher, faster, and then the thunder of boots on concrete as guards moved in formation toward the source. Every cell in Block C went into immediate lockdown. The door slots sealed. The corridor, which had been in its usual supervised activity period, emptied in under 40 seconds. Through the small ventilation gap near the top of Cell 14's door, Miguel could see fragments of movement. Could hear commands being issued. Could hear nothing from whoever they were being issued to. Elias sat on his bunk and did not move. The 2 men from the corner were still and watchful. Carlos had gone to the back of the cell and sat with his back against the wall, arms on his knees. The lockdown lasted 4 hours. No explanation was given before or after. The slot opened at 7 for the evening meal, and the trays came through exactly as they always did, and no guard made eye contact with any of them, and no one in Cell 14 asked any questions. That night, Miguel lay on his bunk and thought about how completely a person could disappear inside these walls, incident, consequence, story, and leave no trace in anyone else's world. It scared him in a way the walls hadn't. Like, share, and subscribe. Miguel Santos had been inside CECOT for 7 days. 7 days with no phone call, no letter, no word from the outside world, no information about his case, his charges, his timeline. Somewhere out there, his mother was waking up every morning not knowing if her son was alive. His sister was going to school carrying that weight. And Miguel was lying on a metal bunk under a light that never turned off, eating rice twice a day, and learning, very slowly, the language of a place that was designed to make men forget they were men. And he was only 7 days in. He would later say, in the only account we have of his experience, pieced together through a journalist's third-party account, that day 7 was the night he understood CECOT completely for the first time. Not the walls or the rules or the tattoo removal or the food. The silence. The way the silence was the real architecture of the place. The way it settled into you if you let it. He decided that night that he would not let it. Miguel is only 1 week in, and what's coming next is what CECOT is really designed to do. If you haven't subscribed yet, do it now and drop a like, because the second half of this story goes places the government doesn't want filmed. Keep watching. By day 30, Miguel Santos had mapped CECOT the only way a prisoner can map a place he cannot move through freely, through pattern recognition and time. He knew the guard's rotation by sound, could identify each shift by the weight of footsteps, the frequency of radio checks, the specific way the third shift guard always dragged his left boot slightly, an old injury, Miguel guessed, that nobody had ever properly treated. He knew the meal timing to within 4 minutes without a watch. He knew which ventilation gap produced a small cross breeze at exactly 2 p.m. when the external temperature was above 85 degrees, which was most days in Tekaluka. This is what CECOT had given him in 30 days. Not hardship, though there was plenty of that. What it had given him, primarily, was time. More unstructured mental time than he had ever possessed in his adult life. On the outside, there was always movement. Always another task, Another problem, another person requiring a decision. In here, there was almost nothing. And the mind, specifically Miguel's mind, which Senora Reyes had identified as mathematically gifted at age 8, did not idle comfortably. It mapped. It catalogued. It observed. He was learning CECOT the way he had once learned Suipango, from the inside out. Elias watched him doing this over several weeks without comment. On day 30, he simply said, "Good." Psychologists who study extreme incarceration have a term for what CECOT is engineered to produce: learned helplessness. It is a state first documented in the 1960s, the phenomenon of a mind that has been given no control over its environment for a sufficient duration that it stops attempting to exert control even when control becomes theoretically available. It is the psychological precondition for complete behavioral compliance. CECOT's design is, whether intentionally or as an emergent property of its policies, almost perfectly calibrated to produce this state. No choices, no variation, no information, no connection to the outside world. The same room, the same light, the same 2 meals, the same sounds, the same faces, day after day after day, with no indicated end date, because most prisoners at CECOT have not been tried in a conventional sense. They are held under the state of exception, which suspends normal due process protections. Miguel had not seen a lawyer. He had not been told the specific charges against him. He had received no communication from his family. He knew this was designed. He had figured that out by day 10. Understanding that it was designed was the only tool he had against it, keeping the part of his mind that was observing separate from the part of his mind that was being observed upon. He sat in the empty cell during exercise hour and breathed deliberately, counting, staying present, refusing the learned helplessness. Elias Moreno had been in CECOT for 11 months before Miguel arrived. He told his story on day 40, in the hour after the evening meal when the guards' rotation produced the longest stretch of reduced corridor activity. He told it quietly, flatly, without drama, the way a man recounts something he has processed so many times it has lost its emotional texture. He had been a driver for MS-13's logistics operation for 3 years in the early 2010s. Then he had left, genuinely left, in the complicated way that leaving ever happens, married, had 2 daughters, worked at a tire shop in Santa Ana for 11 years. His past was known, but he had not been active. When the state of exception sweeps came, his name was on a list that had not been updated in over a decade. He had been taken from his tire shop in front of 4 customers and his young employee on a Tuesday morning. His daughters were 11 and 14. He had not spoken to them since. The cell was completely silent when he finished. Not the institutional silence of CECOT's corridors. The chosen silence of 8 men sitting with a story that contained more weight than any of them were immediately equipped to handle. Carlos, who had not spoken more than 20 words in 40 days, said, very quietly, "I'm sorry." Elias nodded once. And that was the most human moment Miguel Santos had witnessed since arriving. On day 52, something shifted in Block C. Miguel felt it before he understood it. A change in the frequency of guard movement, a disruption in the pattern he had spent 7 weeks memorizing. More personnel in the corridor. Transfers happening at an unusual hour. The radio traffic that he could sometimes hear through the ventilation gap was more frequent, more clipped. Then the door of cell 14 opened at a time that was completely outside any pattern Miguel had documented. A guard called 2 names. One of the 2 men from the corner, the one Miguel had tagged as the quieter of the pair, the follower in their unspoken alliance, stood up immediately. His partner remained seated, face neutral, but Miguel caught the micro-expression that passed between them. Not fear, something more complex. Recognition. They had known this was coming. The quiet man walked to the door without looking back. It closed behind him. His partner sat on the bunk and returned his gaze to the middle distance, and his expression returned to neutral so quickly it was almost frightening. Miguel looked at Elias. Elias was already lying back on his bunk with his eyes closed. Later, Miguel would think that was the day he truly understood that CECOT didn't just hold people. It divided them, severed connections, made alliances dangerous because any alliance could be ended without notice, without explanation, without any acknowledgement that it had existed at all. Atomization. Complete atomization. On day 60, for the first time, the cell block received a small number of written communications from outside. 3 letters, distributed to 3 men in Block C. Not cell 14. Other cells. Miguel heard about it through the micronetwork of information that existed in CECOT. The occasional permitted word during exercise hour, the sound from adjacent cells, the fragments that Elias had spent nearly a year learning to piece together. 3 letters. Filtered, read by administration, delayed by months in the institutional process. But real. Paper. Words from people who had not been erased. The young man 2 cells down, Miguel didn't know his name, reportedly sat on his bunk and read his letter 6 times. Then folded it into the smallest possible square and placed it inside his uniform against his chest, and wore it there for days because it was the only physical evidence that anyone outside these walls still held his existence in their thoughts. Miguel received nothing. He had known, logically, that he wouldn't. The system was random and slow, and his family may not have even known the correct process for attempting contact. Logically, he knew this. He still spent the rest of that afternoon sitting on his bunk in a silence that was different in quality from his normal silence. More interior, more still. Carlos, who had slowly been learning to read Miguel's states the way all cellmates eventually do, climbed to the upper bunk and sat beside him without saying anything. Sometimes that was the right thing. By month 3, Miguel Santos's body had changed in ways that surprised him. He had expected to deteriorate. Institutional food, no exercise equipment, limited movement. His working assumption had been that he would grow soft and slow inside CECOT. Instead, something else happened. With nothing to do and nowhere to go and 23 hours a day in a space that was 12 feet by 12 feet, Miguel had begun exercising with a consistency he had never maintained on the outside. Not because he had decided to. It had started almost involuntarily, a physical restlessness that needed somewhere to go. Push-ups in the morning, bodyweight movements in whatever space the cell allowed, running in place during the brief exercise hour in the enclosure. He had recruited Carlos, then, surprisingly, one of the other men in the cell. Then another. Elias watched this without joining, but Miguel caught him smiling once, or close to it. What Miguel understood, by day 90, was that he was doing something CECOT's design actively worked against. He was building routine that was self-generated rather than institutionally imposed. He was creating a small structure of agency inside a system designed to eliminate agency. It was not resistance in any grand sense. It was not protest or defiance or ideology. It was simply a man refusing to be only what the walls said he was, and it was keeping him, barely, intact. On day 9 to 5, Carlos Vega broke. There was no specific trigger that Miguel could identify. One moment Carlos was sitting on his bunk during the long afternoon. The next, he was standing in the center of the cell making a sound that was not quite crying. Something beyond crying, something that came from a place that regular grief hadn't reached yet. A sound of complete system failure. The men in the cell reacted in different ways. 2 turned toward the wall. One stood up uncertain, unsure whether intervention would help or escalate. Miguel came down from his bunk without thinking. He did not touch Carlos, did not say platitudes, did not offer reassurance that he couldn't substantiate. He simply stood near him, and when Carlos's legs gave out and he sat down hard on the concrete floor, Miguel sat down on the floor too. They stayed there for a long time. Eventually, Carlos's breathing slowed. Not calmed, there was no calm in it, just slowed to a rate that was sustainable. He looked at Miguel. Eyes wrecked, face open in a way that prison usually closes. He said, "I don't know how you're still okay." Miguel looked at him for a moment. "I'm not okay," he said. "I'm just still here." That distinction, between being okay and still being here, was the most honest thing Miguel had said to another person in 9 to 5 days. Carlos nodded slowly, and then, very slowly, he got up off the floor. On day 110, Elias Moreno did not get up for the morning alarm. He was conscious. He told Miguel, when Miguel came to the lower bunk and looked at him, that his chest felt wrong. Had felt wrong for 2 days. He had not said anything because, as he explained without any particular emotion, saying something would require a medical interaction, and medical interactions in CECOT were, in his experience, unpredictable in their outcomes and therefore to be avoided unless the alternative was death. Miguel made the assessment that the alternative might be approaching that category. He called for the guard at the door. This was an unusual act in cell 14. Guards were not typically called. You waited for guard contact. You did not initiate it. The other men in the cell watched with an attention that confirmed Miguel's read on the cultural norm he was violating. It took 11 minutes for a guard to respond. Medical was notified. Elias was removed from the cell on a stretcher 2 hours later, a 2-hour wait that Miguel spent sitting next to him on the lower bunk, monitoring his breathing with the careful attention of someone who has nothing else to do and understands that presence is its own form of aid. As they took him out, Elias reached back and pressed something small into Miguel's hand. A folded piece of paper, something he had been writing on for weeks. Miguel didn't open it until the cell door closed. The letter was 3 pages, written in the small, careful handwriting of a man who had been rationing paper. It was addressed not to Miguel by name, but to whoever needs this. It covered, in that same flat, processed tone Elias used when he spoke, the 11 months he had spent at CECOT before Miguel arrived. The specific stages of psychological adjustment. The point, around month 2, when a man's sense of time begins to distort, when a day starts to feel like a week and a week starts to feel like a day and the distinction stops mattering. The physical adjustments, the social dynamics of a cell, how alliances formed and what they were actually for, how to eat slowly, how to sleep under the lights, how to be present in your own mind when every structural feature of your environment was designed to make you absent. There was a section about his daughters, about what he thought they might be doing each day at the times he knew their schedules. School, homework, the younger one's football practice on Thursday afternoons. There was, at the end, a single line about faith. Not religious faith specifically, something wider, about the necessity, for survival, of believing in the continued existence of a world outside the walls even when all evidence of it had been systematically removed. The world doesn't end at the wall, he had written. The wall is inside the world. Remember that difference. Miguel read it twice, then folded it and placed it against his chest, exactly where the man 2 cells down had put his letter. 4 months into CECOT, Miguel Santos was not the same man who had arrived on that bus. This was not a redemption arc in the cinematic sense. He had not found God or renounced his past in a single dramatic moment. It was quieter and more complicated than that. It was the slow, grinding accumulation of days in which the person you had performed for the world was systematically removed. The rank, the reputation, the intimidation, the armor, until only the interior of you remained. And what Miguel found in his interior was not what he had expected. He found the 8-year-old in Senora Reyes's classroom. The boy who had been good at numbers. The boy whose mother had held a teacher's words like a small lamp against the dark. He did not know what to do with this discovery. He had no mechanism for it. The life he had built on the outside had no architecture for the person now sitting in cell 14, doing morning push-ups with a 19-year-old who might or might not have done anything wrong, reading a dead man's survival letter. Elias had not returned from medical, by the light of a ceiling fixture that never, ever turned off. He only knew that Elias's last line lived in him now. The world doesn't end at the wall. The wall is inside the world. He lay on his bunk and breathed slowly. He was still here. As of the time this story was compiled, Miguel Santos remains inside CECOT. He has not been formally tried. He has had one confirmed contact with a legal representative, a volunteer attorney working with a human rights coalition, approximately 5 months after his arrival. That attorney has filed documentation with El Salvador's legal system. The case moves slowly through a court infrastructure that is processing tens of thousands of similar filings simultaneously. His mother has been to the CECOT perimeter twice, joining the lines of families who gather at the exterior gates with photographs and handwritten names, hoping for confirmation that the person in the photo is alive and where they believe him to be. On both visits, she received the same response from officials, that information about individual prisoners could not be confirmed or denied at the gate. She went back anyway. This is what CECOT looks like from the outside. Families standing at a wall, holding photographs of people who have disappeared into a system that was, by design, built to be opaque. Some of those people are genuinely dangerous men who terrorize communities. Some of them are Elias Moreno. Some of them may be Carlos Vega. The wall does not distinguish. The question that the Salvadoran government frames as answered, what do you do with the most violent gang members in the hemisphere, remains, for human rights observers, deeply, urgently open. Because a solution that cannot be questioned is not a solution. It is just a different kind of cage. Miguel Santos wakes up every morning to the same ceiling. The same light. The same 7 men, different from the original 7 now. The cell population having shifted twice through transfers he couldn't predict or explain. He does his push-ups. He eats his rice slowly. He keeps Elias's letter against his chest under the white uniform. And somewhere in Soyapango, his mother wakes up and goes to work and holds on to the words of a teacher from 30 years ago, because that is the only lamp she has against a very specific and very particular kind of dark. CECOT is not the end of the story of El Salvador's gang crisis. It is a chapter, a dramatic, controversial, internationally scrutinized chapter, in a story that will take decades to fully tell. Whether it represents justice, or warehouse management, or something that has not yet been fully named, depends entirely on which life you are looking at it from. From inside cell 14 of Block C, it looks like a light that never turns off. And a man who is still here. Still here. If this story made you think, hit that like button. It takes 2 seconds and it means everything to this channel. Subscribe if you haven't. Every single week we go inside the stories that the world's most dangerous prisons don't want told. The next video is already waiting for you on screen right now. I'll see you inside.